So I started recording, which means that everyone is basically first the camera is off and your screen stops sharing. So no, this doesn't happen accidentally. So if people want to be on camera, then um, you would have to do it again
Yeah,
and the
that's fine.
share screen.
Don't think that worked. Hold on. Okay, I think it works now. Or no? I'm going to take silence as a no. Sorry, it says yes, that it is recording.
It is
And you can
working.
see it.
It is working.
Yeah, great. So thanks, Piotr, for the introduction. And yes, I'm Parth. I'm from Scotland, if you are not aware, in St Andrews. And yeah, I'm looking forward to giving this workshop on populism. So let's go through what I'm going to discuss. I'm not sure if I will take up an hour because I've not timed it, but it definitely won't be more than that, but it might be slightly shorter, but we'll see. I do tend to talk quite, ramble, so we'll see. So I'm going to be covering a couple of things. So firstly, what is populism, why it matters, and also thought it'd be really interesting to talk about how people may not talk about populism in nuanced or often strategic ways, which may make arguments appear to be weaker. Just go through voter behavior, because even though this is not necessarily solely to do with populism, it's important to maybe understand how voters interact. Then talk briefly about social movements, because I think social movements is a good example of where populism can actually be, quote unquote, something that seems more acceptable, or at least can be quite effective, or uses similar means as politicians do. And that might help you view it in a different way that helps you generate maybe arguments where you might be asked to defend populism. And then I'll finally maybe talk about good/neutral cases. The reason that they're in, what do you call it, like inverted commas, is because they may not necessarily be like perfect people and might have done quite bad things, but they have done sometimes quite good things, which are important to discuss. Okay, so first of all, what is populism? Does anyone want to maybe come in and give their view on what they think it is? If not, that is absolutely fine. I can't see the chat or don't know how to access the chat. So if someone puts something in the chat, then someone will have to tell me that it's in the chat. It's not a trick question, but otherwise I'm happy to just carry on.
I can read out the chat if someone wants to put something in the chat.
Thank you, Piotr.
It's a bit harder when you're sharing the screen, but
yeah.
Okay,
fine.
we have a lot of silence, so maybe I'll just help here. What for me, kind of like the populism is oftentimes saying what people want to hear, kind of like sounding nice, having like nice, fluffy, easy ideas for people to digest and to be standing behind.
Yeah, definitely a core component. I'll give it a couple seconds or so if someone wants to come in. Yes, I think I see someone with a hand up, but I don't know who it is because I can't see it on my share screen. So whoever it is, please feel free.
It is I. So also the idea of creating an enemy, so creating usually the people as a large and putting them against a small elite that wants to take everything from them.
Yeah, great. Largely, you've got most of it. But so the first thing that's really, really important is I would say that populism is not necessarily an ideology. And the reason why this is so important, which I'll go into in later slides, is that often debaters can assume that populism is quite right-wing. And often it is. I think most populists that we can name are probably right-wing, especially in the bottom right photo. Most of them are, to be honest. But it is more about the style and strategy. And that's what Piotr and I think Daniel, spoke, were talking about in terms of a lot of the suggestions that have just been made just now were more about how they frame themselves. So it's important to look at populism necessarily as how people use ideas that maybe politicians are already talking about or trying to discuss, but changing the way that they talk about it. So, for example, immigration might be a very good topic here, because even though parties generally do tend to have policies on immigration, they don't necessarily cut through these policies, but it tends to be populists who capture this space on immigration policy because of the way that they talk about it. So this is an important aspect of that. And we've already had an emphasis on the common voter and a deprioritization of the political structure. So this is a fancy way of saying that it's about you as an individual. And this is really important because it's about the messaging that is necessarily being implemented. It's not about necessarily passing policy or the outcomes of policy, but tends to be about your experiences and what you necessarily want or care about. And it's more about that initial start of the equation when it comes to considering what policies to pass. What do voters actually want? And then also deprioritization of political structures, which can often look like opposition to the political elite, as we've already mentioned. So this could be technocrats, so for example, civil servants. It could be the judiciary, so the court system, etc. And then not always, but sometimes they can be anti-establishment or anti-political in the way that they engage. So, for example, they think that the classic Trump draining the swamp, where they think that the establishment has not been working, mainly due to the sort of increase in how technocratic government's becoming, maybe less democratic, even if there is an election. Who controls the levers of power in government is a really important thing. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, if anyone wants to chime in or interrupt me, please do. You don't have to wait until the end, because it's probably easier for it to be fresh in your mind if you interrupt me, and also it's probably better to have a better conversation when it's actually the slide that's relevant to. So, why does populism then matter in politics motions in general? So there are lots of motions where it might not necessarily be about populism. So I had a search earlier today where I looked at how many motions are actually populist, that have populism in it, and the only like eye-catching ones were probably like the Cambridge IV final a couple of years ago, and then the Panama Worlds EFL final, and well, in Europe and globally. So it's important to maybe to think about why we should run populism arguments in politics motions, which may not necessarily have the populism in the word, but could be important, or any democracy motion actually. So first of all, the most obvious one is that it's incredibly relevant globally. So we know that there are a lot of populist leaders who are becoming increasingly popular. So for example, Trump, Nigel Farage, Piotr mentioned the Dutch example, I think Wilders or whatever his name is, and then also the AFD is a good example. So we have key examples. But also democratic discontent. And this is really important, is that everyone assumes that there are just a key group of apathetic voters that maybe don't vote because policy doesn't represent them, etc. We're starting to see a trend where active voters are people who actively vote and have voted for several election cycles, may have an established political party, maybe are a member of a party, are showing discontent with the system, and that could be for a variety of reasons. So, for example, are these democratic structures which we talk about, so for example, parliaments, governments, still democratic or legitimate, and who speaks for them? And what I necessarily mean by this, and this is important, is that a lot of things that we find in right now, for example, when it comes to policy, can be affected by lobbyists, could be affected by maybe market forces, so big businesses being able to implement what they think that they want the policy to be. Civil servants, for example, so that especially when it comes to economic policy, might be trying to maybe lower debt or maybe trying to make the books balanced, but that might be at the detriment of other things. So, for example, welfare cuts, etc., in times of economic crises, for example, cost of living crises, with the Putin's oil invasion of Ukraine affecting oil prices, etc. The UK government, for example, decided to care more about balancing the books, maybe, and that caused massive energy price increases, but then not necessarily thinking about how to reduce it. So it's about whether the democratic structures are actually viewing people's preferences. And this is why I put legitimate here, because often democracy is about whether you are representing the voter and what they actually want. And then that then feeds into that populism. That's really important as well. really importantly here, and this is a big thing that could be very useful framing in debating in general, is that it challenges the norm of what we consider to be left and right in politics in general, not just in debating, but in life, is that a big thing about populism is it's very big tent. And what I mean by that is that it straddles both sides of the political spectrum. So, for example, Nigel Farage in the UK, who's a very polarizing figure who's doing quite well in opinion polling right now, uh, is very keen on, stopping immigration, reducing it significantly. But he's also more welfarist than most of the left-wing representation in Parliament. And that's very interesting because they've made loads of welfare cuts, but he would restore all of them, but also be very, very hardline about immigration. So what this shows is that often populists think about the ways in which people could be affected by things that are, across the political spectrum, and trying to be maybe more pragmatic about the way in which they view things. Maybe it's pragmatism for self-interested reasons, i.e. being elected, but it is really pushing the fact that we don't need to sit in specific camps. But we also do see this, right? So we see this in, you could think of maybe an MP or a member of parliament or anywhere in your own country or maybe in the Dutch system where you can think of a person who maybe is not agreeing with the party line. So this is definitely something that exists, but it's about historically, but it's about how it's affecting the entire system because it's becoming more popular, right? So it's about, does the left-right binary actually work there? And then also, and this is another piece of framing which is really useful in debating, but it's really important in populism, is the modes by which politics is discussed. So we see a lot of the rise of the internet, social media, and this is where a lot of debate can be quite inflammatory. So it could be quite based on people's identity, it could be based on attacking people, it could be a culture of misinformation, or because of the fact that news is becoming more short form. Even if, let's say, you're trying to be good-willed in the way that you're trying to get information across, it might be hard for the voter to get information from a headline or from a 15-second clip or from a short article because they're trying to compete in the news space, and the death of traditional news is an effect of, it has affected this, right? So, and algorithms, for example, pushing certain content onto your feed, etc. So politics is changing, and that's how people receive their political news, and that's affecting their preferences. Now, also, there's a commentary of the meta of debating where I've talked mainly about framing. When you think about what I mean by the meta is the choices and the strategies you're trying to implement in debating, or the things that may work the best. So you could think about, this sort of framing of populism in politics motions is that where is most of the democratic instability likely to be? And that may be the strongest comparative. So, for example, if you think about the standard parties, maybe you do have voting blocks which will still vote for them, but it could be not necessarily the swing voters, but the people who are disenfranchised with the system, even if they're active voters, who'd be where the instability lies and therefore is likely to be the most comparative, right? Which is why populism might matter in a politics motion, or a motion where it's not necessarily about politics, which we'll discuss in a second, or the intensity of the impact, right? So people's preferences changing massively, or the way in which people view the system are really intense impacts, because even if they're not material, they're still conscious impacts which may affect people's view of the world, which is still really important. And it affects, for example, what policies a party should adopt. So even if you're not populist, it may affect, for example, how a party responds. So, for example, in the UK, the Nigel Farage's the party is called Reform UK, and you may know them as the UK Conservative Party, which is a traditional centre-right party. There's loads of commentating in the UK about the death of the Conservative Party. So the Conservative Party is looking to go down the drain quite quickly, in that it's losing massive amounts of support. And in response to that, the Conservative Party have gone more to the right. Whether that's a good thing or not, well, that's up for debate and probably not part of this presentation. But it probably will come up later. But in this section, what I'm trying to talk about is that parties may respond to populists. So even if populism might not be the biggest thing in that country, it changes the way that other individuals react, right? And for example, the classic thing in maybe like a narrative motion is that this narrative is not in isolation. There's lots of other narratives that exist. Similar in politics, you react to what the other parties are doing to try and capture the voter base, right? So that's really important. But also what voters to target, right? So this is really important in that often debaters just assume that, oh, well, the swing voters are the only ones that are important. But there's lots of active voters, which I've just talked about. So, for example, the people who think that a left-wing party is trying to balance the books because it's trying to be economically competent, but it's losing its values, for example, of welfarism, etc. And those voters might then leave for a populist party, right? So even the active voters matter. So the groups of individuals you're trying to target within populism and how much comparative you can generate from that will change for that as well. Motions about voting reform. So, for example, having young people have double the vote, or having old people have less of the vote, or changing the political system, or having and for example, like you need a certain percentage of the vote to get seats, for example, right? Like the classic German system. So all of these things matter there as well because it affects how people view the system as well. Or process reform. So, for example, banning or allowing political donations, or the types of lobbying you can have. Could you have pressure groups? So, for example, are you allowed to have like the US system where there's millions of donations from groups who are lobbying them? And that can affect populism as well. Or the classic one, which is just superstructures, right? So, for example, the EU and like Euroscepticism, etc. And like often populist parties tend to be more Eurosceptic. And that can be left wing or right wing, to be clear, as well. So, and then how could it be important in terms of general politics arguments? So, for example, common metrics you could have in politics or democracy motions are, representation, and how well people are being represented, accountability. So, for example, are politicians doing things that they said they're doing, or are they being lobbied? The legitimacy I talked about, or the preference aggregation. So are you actually like representing people's preferences well? And then I think that's the main things as to why it's important for the let's quote unquote meta of debating. So I want to talk briefly about what we just discussed, but maybe let's talk about motions where populism is not in the title of the motion, but could be really important. So does anyone want to, even if you don't have it doesn't have to be necessarily a motion. I've got a couple of motions from this year that I've found that could have a populism angle to it. You don't need to come up with a fully formed idea. It could just be like, I think there could be a populism angle in a motion about this, without having to word it, obviously, because we're not, it's not coming up on the fly would be very hard. But can anyone think of maybe topics where it's not necessarily on populism or like very clearly about a very niche part of politics? I mean, there are some broader politics motions where it may not be obvious to run populism, but could be relevant. Anyone have any ideas?
Any EU motion, you can run the Euroscepticism argument based on what the EU should do.
Yeah, that's a great example. So a debate about political alliances or for example, like integration, whether that's politically or otherwise, that's a good example.
You were also saying about social movements, I think, and then you could think about, depending on how you categorize groups of people in society to be more pro or more against social movements, you can also make arguments of why they are that way and how they feel disenfranchised, and then you get to the populism part of things.
Yeah, great. That's a great example.
So there's someone in the group chat who also said a motion, which is this has to automatically install minority government led by the largest party if coalitions take too long.
What was the last bit, sorry?
So this house would automatically install a minority government led by the largest party if
Yeah.
coalitions take too long.
Yes, that's a good idea. Yeah, that's more about um, again, what I was saying earlier is that it could be a broad politics motion, but populism creates an environment where people have to react to it. So that is a definitely a good example of a broader politics motion where people don't immediately go to that. Yeah. So I have another couple of ideas if no one else wants to come in, which is absolutely fine. For example, the internet or any motion about social media, way in which things like information are processed or communicated could be a really great example. And this is something that I think this was at Utrecht Open, and this is a great motion for you to run this in, because you could weigh stuff like political preferences, the fact that it affects people's lives, but it also affects other people's lives, which could be also a great weighing mechanism that you could use. And then also talk about how the rise of the internet is so clear in causing populism because it's a tool for political mobilization. And you could also talk about the fact that it's a good thing, right? So social movements can mobilize better. You can find and pick and choose the ones which are better for you, for example, right? So you can go to there's more ability for you to organize fringe groups or different groups because you can find like-minded people who may necessarily be you, etc. Right? So that's a really common example. I would definitely suggest motions about the way in which people view the world or interact with the world. You can definitely have a politics angle there. This one's slightly a harder one, but this is definitely another. Economics is a great example. So shifting away from deep economic global integration towards protectionism. So, for example, this is something that you could talk about. For example, Wana talks about the EU, and then also talking about the fact that you tend to care more about the nation as a whole, the fact that you should be protecting one's self and be prioritizing oneself. So, for example, a common example of this is the USA, who've increased tariffs on steel production, for example, to try and help the Rust Belt, Pittsburgh steel producers, etc., who've been hard for them to sell their steel because American manufacturers are getting their steel cheaper elsewhere, which has affected deindustrialization in these areas. And then this is a good example of that. And this could be a populism example here. Maybe not necessarily going to be an argument necessarily, but a framing device that could be really, really important here in the way in which the policy manifests. And I think that would be really important. And then also the skepticism towards political compromise within progressive spaces. So this could be about the way in which people interact with people and talking about it. This actually reminds me of another motion which I ran a populism in, which is this house supports people making an active effort to make friends across this political spectrum. And this could be important for like blind spots and how people view the world, how people interact with or mock or demonize other people's views, how it's important that if you're more pragmatic in the way you view things, less ideological, and what I mean by pragmatism is making sure you focus on why something is important or why it could have an important effect, rather than just focusing on what your values are, but how the world could be improved regardless of the things that you believe in your value set. This could be important in maybe affecting populism. So, for example, populist voters may that people are not listening to what they're saying, etc. So this could be another important aspect here. I mean, this is probably an example of where it's more easy for you to think about this argument. But again, it's not necessarily like the only argument. So yeah. And then something that Arena just said about social movements. So you can talk about maybe like an eco-terrorism motion, and how, like, for example, social movements are likely to form, and how they spread their awareness, what they do, and if they're effective. Because populism doesn't have to necessarily be electoral populism. Then also maybe another politics motion, which is free voting. So this is basically where in parliaments, you can have free votes or something called whipped votes. So a whipped vote is where you are forced to vote in the way your party wants you to vote, whereas free voting means you can vote on whatever the way you want. So this could be on more matters of conscience. So, for example, if there's an abortion law or something like that, then, or assisted dying or euthanasia, often political parties will let them vote the way they are, the way they want to, because often it's not a very like ideological thing, and then it can also cause problems if you don't give people free votes. And again, this could be about how trying to have established political camps across ideological lines could cause a breeding ground for populist rhetoric. Because if you're trying to be a big tent, like Nigel Farage is in the UK, if you're not solving issues pragmatically, but trying to be ideological, often, for example, a U-turn, so thinking that you're wrong about a policy and going back on it, or admitting that you don't have the answer, or needing to like ask other people for answers and not just having the policy that you had at the election time and not considering other options because it will make you look bad, is important in how people view things and vote on things, right? This was at Oxford, which was about introducing a constitutional review assembly, which is basically like 200 people could decide what needs to be reviewed in the constitution rather than having like 2/3 majority of states or whatever. And a big argument here, which is quite like important, is just how populism is important in making sure people feel represented, which could be a good idea here, but also how populists might be capturing the sentiment of voters in bad ways on the other side. So, for example, it could be more sensible changes to constitution. So, for example, voting reform or removing the Second Amendment on gun rights, etc. And that could be a negative argument for that motion, right? Like why you should have that. Or, for example, regretting the rise of citizen journalism. So again, I've talked about, this is sort of similar to the first motion, the dissemination of news. How do people view this and how does this inform their preferences? So, for example, a very good argument on op could be like information about Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Palestine, etc. The fact that you just get news almost immediately, and that you might get videos or stories of things that you could never get otherwise, right? But then there could also be an aspect of how people internalize this, how politics interacts with citizen journalism, and how traditional media is dying, etc. I've spoken about. So there's lots of good examples where populism could be a really good example. And what I spoke about before in the meta section is often when you are dealing with a phenomenon which is inherently unstable, often the comparative can be quite large. You can generally prove something quite well. And if, for example, voters could change from election to election, the way in which populists view policies could change, this is a great example of running an argument here, because this will, a populist argument in some emotions which may not necessarily be about populism, because that could be a great device to prove that there's clearly a change. And I'll go into that in the next couple of slides. Okay, just again, if there's any questions, let me know. So, common traps when debating populism. So the first one is just outcome bias. So often debaters would just say, well, populism is bad, and then that's it, and they move on. That's not good. We shouldn't be doing this. Often you need to ask yourself, if you do want to say populism is bad, is it a priori bad? So this is just a fancy word for just saying, is it like always or inherently bad? Like, should we just oppose it always? And the important thing here is that populism doesn't necessarily mean extremism. So, for example, you can have left-wing populists like Bernie Sanders, and I sometimes debaters think that debating in general is quite left-wing biased, and most debaters may agree that Bernie Sanders doesn't do anything inherently wrong. In fact, he has done lots of good things for the political system in the USA in opening up new conversations, which I'll talk about in the last slide. And so, for example, this is important to note. Or, for example, you could explain why identity politics, or creating us versus them, which someone raised when I'm defining what is populism, like the common enemy, explaining why that is a priori bad. So why, for example, disengaging certain voters in preference of others is not a legitimate thing to do. So that could be a reason why. So don't just go, oh, well, populists are likely to cause electoral corruption. That's, and that means populism is bad and we should oppose it. And that could be vulnerable to an attack from another team who says, well, there's some good things about populism, right? So, and in the last slide with all the motions on it, I explained that there could be good and bad things about populism on both sides, right? So you want to make sure you're engaging in the right way, right? That's how in classic debate, and we say explain why left-wing policies are good, etc. Well, you should be doing that anyway, but often it is true that left-wing policies often tend to be more intuitive to the average voter, to be honest. So it doesn't really matter. But yeah, okay. And then also this classic assumption that populists want to just gain power and have no solutions. And even if it seems a bit obvious, often people tend to talk about populists as if they're just messaging tools, or they just say things and that they don't really do much. But often there are examples of when there could be a group of voters, so for example, an indigenous group who necessarily feel underrepresented, and then they get more rights because that person is in power now and gives them more land rights, for example. And there's lots of examples across Africa and Latin America where populists do have good solutions, and I'll explain why it often doesn't end up well for them, but it often do have good solutions, and it's important to make sure you're being nuanced in the way that you talk about people. I already spoke about this one, but the assumption that voter behavior is static, and then the classic thing in politics motions is that, guys, we should only care about the swing voters because right-wing people will vote right-wing and left-wing people will vote left-wing. So, we only care about the people who don't have are undecided. And the important thing about populism is that there are lots of politically active people who tend to vote in populist ways, or people could leave their established voting camp or bloc and move to that populist individual or party. There's not necessarily about swing voters. Often swing voters do tend to engage in populism probably better because they tend to be more apathetic or don't tend to have fixed value sets when it comes to politics in general. So for example, a very good example of this is in the north of England, like for example the Rust Belt in America, which may be more an accessible example. So for example, deindustrialized mining, car industries, steel industries. But more so for the UK actually, because they tend to vote Labour, so that's the left-wing party, insane amounts. Their majorities for these seats are so large, because they tend to be more left-wing, because they care about welfarism, the fact that they're more trade unionist, and the fact that the Labour Party are tended to be more pro workers, but also ethnic minorities. So for example, they tend to be more caring about racial equality and stuff. But what is starting to become apparent is that a lot of the safe seats have been taken away from the Labour Party. Clearly, for example, when it comes to ethnic minorities, their view on Gaza and Israel has been massive in very Muslim majority seats. They've lost lots of seats. The Conservatives have won a lot of seats from them because they think that the Labour Party is becoming too centrist. So these are examples, and they are projected Reform, who's Nigel Farage's party, is projected to do very well in Northern England in the next election. So thinking about the fact that populism is not about swing voters, but it's about all voters and the way in which they engage. So be careful when you talk about, oh, well, there's only a small comparative, and that can be good to strategically narrow the debate to help you frame it more tightly. But there could be scenarios where it's not just swing voters. Okay. And then also the characterization of the populist voter. So a lot of times you could frame them as, well, they might be undereducated, or they might be easy to sway, or they might be very, very opinionated. For example, they have strong views about how social policy is implemented, etc. But also they can have legitimate concerns which are not brainwashed. So, for example, you could vote for populist politicians because you have no job security, or you're living in an area of high inequality, or your wages are not growing, right? Or in the global south, or in a developing country, you see loads of brain drain, or there's high wealth inequality because you see high rural urban inequality, like India or Brazil, etc. So it's often linked populism to declining in living standards, and it tends to follow cultural backlash, maybe. So, for example, the more global, the global village, as it were, the more connected we are online, the more we can see that people are different from each other. That tends to create sometimes quite exclusionary views, right? And that might be, that often we think that that's a bad thing, and that is a bad thing, not being tolerant of people. But the way in which they formed that view may not necessarily be from a view that they actually want to hate on these people, but they're just scared or they're anxious about the world, right? So that could also be the fact that the populist voter may not be like a raging racist, for example, right? But the outcomes are not great. But the way in which they viewed that is, it might be a legitimate way that they've come to that opinion, but the outcome is not legitimate, right? Or rather, you'd hope. And then also, importantly, I've talked about the internet. That could also be a way in which people gain their news. And maybe it's the fact that they don't have a balance of news, or they struggle maybe to understand the complexities of policy, right? And that could be another aspect of that. Or the presence of, again, as the world is becoming more globalized, the elites or the civil servants, where you feel disengaged. You feel like maybe there is good policy, but you feel like people aren't listening to you, which is also a valid preference. So, for example, you could think you might join a social movement like a really populist environmental movement, because you think even though there are some policies towards net zero, you think that, oh well, it's not going far enough because of lobbying, right? And that's a legitimate preference as well, right? And then also that populism is right wing. So it can often, the worst examples tend to be right wing. But you can have left-wing populism. For example, left-wing populists can also be anti-globalist. So there are lots of left-wing populists who are anti-EU, for example. You could look at redistribution policies or racial rights, for example. That could be racial. We believe in the common person. We believe in equality. We believe that you should get a say. That's a very populist thing to say, but that could also be left-wing, right? So that's really important as well. Sorry, I need to go quicker, I think. Right, let's talk about then voter behavior. So I've already spoken about the Goldilocks zone. What I mean by that is voters are not completely rational, but they're not also completely irrational. So they're very good at knowing what they care about, their lived experiences. So, for example, if they care about high crime, because maybe they've seen a lot of crime in their area, right? They may know what they would like to vote for and what they care about, and in terms of like what they would like to see. But the solutions on how to get there, for example, reducing immigration, for example, might be very hard for anyone to really understand, even a politician, I guess. It's very difficult for you to do that. It's just particular policy, I guess. And so this really important when you're thinking about voter behavior is don't go, the voter is going to get it right, and that's why this will happen, or no, the voter's stupid, so this framing means that this will happen, right? So remember, when you're trying to do the debate, make sure you think about the nuances of what do you expect the voter to know and behave, but what do you think they won't be good at doing, right? But values and principles are becoming more important in voter behavior and identity-based politics. And this could be because the world is becoming increasingly complex and noisy. What I mean by noisy is that there's lots and lots of things going on. As the world is becoming interconnected, there's more emphasis on trade, alliances that are growing deeper. So the EU integration is going faster, and that's important. The internet is really saturated with loads of content. The global village means that we understand more about the world, but do we understand it perfectly? We just know about things more because the social media tells us about things that we may not know if we didn't have social media. But we need people to tell us about these complicated issues, which means that you voting based on the person and based on the identity marker becomes more palatable because you want an easy way to attach yourself to something, right? And then simple messages are then important in like policy explanations, and you want to have simple messages to deal with that complexity, right? So that's why values and principles are becoming more important, because there are lots of things that we could deal with policy. So, for example, I don't know if you're at Rotterdam pre-Euros, the round 3 motion on whether you should send prisoners to foreign prisons or do more community-led rehabilitation of like house arrest, etc. There's lots of policies that can deal with lots of things, and the world's becoming more interconnected. So there's lots of new avenues of policy you can explore, and also importantly, new things you have to consider. So, for example, is your defense or foreign policy on one country going to affect how another country views you, right? So all of this means that life is not as simple as it were before. And also, for example, with economics, you could have an economic downturn could have a contagion effect on another country. So, for example, COVID affecting global supply chains. So again, there's lots of really complex things. And now this is why populism is really important, and why voters may necessarily start not becoming more irrational, but start changing the way that they are thinking about the world. And then also there's shifting demographics. So the younger population may necessarily want more, but the older population might be resentful of that, right? There could be more multicultural societies, which affects the way in which they engage in voting patterns, or that there could be communities which turn inwards and focus on themselves because they're afraid about the world or future uncertainty. So, for example, they may create like parallel institutions, for example, like more focusing on community-led action, etc., which may cause apathy towards a general political system, right? So there's lots of other things we need to consider, that the voters are not a stable concept anymore, like the binary is not there as well. So that's important to note. Right, going on to social movements. So this is a good example of a bottom-up populism, because that's what populism aims to be, but often it's not, because, you know, politicians are politicians. So, you know, there are some good examples of social movements. Well, a lot of these have not been successful, but maybe I think the importance of why this slide matters is that I'm putting this slide in to maybe humanize populist action, because I've obviously spoken about all of the dangers maybe of populism, and like maybe how it can be quite ineffective. And in the later slides, I will talk about politicians who are populist and have done good things, but often they end up doing quite bad things as well. So maybe social movements are a good way for you to think about how they can be, like how you can argue for populism. And we often employ these arguments I'm just going to talk about in social movements debates, but you can transfer them to populism debates really easily. So you can think about the non-political benefits of populism, right? So it's not just about policy outcomes, but for example, about community building, catharsis, you know, feeling like you're understood, awareness. So for example, do you get more information about how a perspective of another lived experience that you wouldn't have had? So for example, the critique of the anti-establishment or elites might not necessarily be, oh, you know, they're terrible, they're not doing a good job, but maybe it's because they might be doing a decent job. They just don't understand different preferences and don't understand that there could be multiple ways of viewing something, right? And then also parallel institutions. So, for example, I thought the case if you've not watched the Glasgow Open Final, I thought the closing opposition case was quite clever in talking about state distrust. They spoke about how parallel institutions could actually be quite a good thing. For example, the development of food banks, the development of social movements and social structures, which help people in the world to like feel like okay with their existence, right? So again, there are lots of aspects of non-policy-led populism which could actually just be used as arguments to prove why social movements are sorry, why there are non-political benefits to populism, right? So, obviously, you may know about the yellow vests. I think this was like mainly this was a couple of years ago, where it was a grassroots protest against fuel taxes and also like pension reform, and it involved into like a broader anti sort of elitist movement, and that they sort of demanded direct democracy reforms. So, for example, more referenda and stuff like that. And, you know, this was really successful because they were able to, Macron then withdrew the fuel tax. And then also he launched, this is probably the best example, because he launched something called like the Great National Debate in France, where he engaged citizen assembly. So this is where you know, like the Constitutional Review Assembly you're talking about, you get 200 people, you ask them what they think and like their lived experiences in their lives, etc., and discussing policy reforms. And that really is important, because even though it's not had a massive impact, this was like a good example of when citizen assemblies in a Western liberal democracy has actually been used, and then actually you are actually taking the view of the people, right? So again, maybe the yellow vests were very successful because they caused the disruption, people protest quite a lot and set loads of things on fire. But it still proved to be a good way of trying to get rid of a policy which probably wouldn't have been feasible because of how successful Renaissance were, which is Macron's party. Like, they had a really big majority and were very popular at the time, right? This is obviously not a great example of outcomes, but the Arab Spring, which were important in toppling a lot of authoritarian leaders in the Middle East, also organized, interestingly, on WhatsApp and WhatsApp communication channels, which could be an interesting social media mechanism if you are, want to care about political mobilization. And that's obviously when that was about anti-corruption, pro-democracy in the Middle East, when there's lots of populist leaders. Obviously, entrenched more populist leaders, for example, Assad in Syria, etc. But it is a great example of where awareness created more change and it galvanized people. And that could be the same with like a couple of other things I've got up here. For example, Occupy Wall Street and Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion in the UK. What these two have specifically done is raise awareness of wealth inequality, environmental damage. And even though they have not implemented what they're saying, the path towards, for example, net zero, even if it's diluted, is more in the mainstream. Like, people talk about it more. It's a voting issue. For example, the UK has a first past the post system, which means it's very, very difficult for small or single issue parties to get elected. But the Green Party got 4 seats in the last general election, and they've had 1 for ages and 0 for a lot of the British political history. And they got massive swings and everywhere else, right? So it does have an impact in how people view policy agendas, because even if they care about a multitude of things, the way they order their preferences and what they care about may shift depending on the way in which they view things. Obviously, a lot of these movements have not had a lot of success because they've been blamed, because public opinion has shifted against them, because they're going to work harder, because they've glued themselves to the road, or for example, or stopped a flight from taking off or something like that. But it has, and also because governmental power is quite large in stopping these movements. But they have created good dialogue, and that could just be a very simple, low burn impact to run. Okay. I think I have spoken about a lot of these already, but just to summarize, you can again have a very simple low burden argument for political participation. You maybe enfranchise groups that you haven't already enfranchised, for example, racial groups and apathetic groups, passing through the noise. So maybe you get better awareness of key issues, or you force other parties to make sure they're clear about their political issues, or you force them to change their policy platforms and to stop being complacent and maybe become more pragmatic, justify their values. So there could be, again, really importantly, it's not about the populists, but it's about how populists cause change in other people, which is really important. An evaluation of the democratic structure, for example, banning political donations motions, for example, or banning lobbyists, or the technocracy motions, it really shines a light on the ways in which it could be anti-democratic, how it could prevent things like democratic backsliding. So a cordon sanitaire, for example, is where you make an agreement among the mainstream political parties to exclude another party. So, for example, a lot of the parties in the German system could just have a cordon sanitaire to exclude the AfD party and say we will never be in a coalition with them. That's a good example of where telling people they don't have a legitimate preference. So, for example, lots of people could have voted for AfD. They see that you've done a cordon sanitaire, and then they feel annoyed because you've blocked a legitimate preference of them. And then lots of politicians think, well, this will blow over. It's a short-term thing. Or they didn't know what they were voting for. But often, you can make the situation worse. And then the AfD just increases in seats in the last federal election in Germany, right? So you could talk about how it prevents worse forms of populism, right, by including them, being tolerant of them. And then also when draining the swamp is actually necessary. So, for example, I'll talk about this in the last slide, but lots of corruption in Latin America. For example, the elites getting loads of preferential subsidies for infrastructure projects, etc. Maybe sometimes stopping these people, or a very politically non-independent judiciary, letting people get away with election interfering, etc., or election corruption. And maybe sometimes there are examples when actually stopping corruption or stopping elites from doing what they want is actually a really important thing to do. And then obviously we can talk about the negatives. So identity politics, so pitting identities against each other, creating an us versus them. Who actually becomes successful populists? So it could be the loudest people who are the most general, so capture the most support. And that creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of populists becoming increasingly general, increasingly inflammatory, because they want to be the most successful populist. And then other parties trying to become more populist in response to them. So then it creates a race to the bottom in terms of like populism, right? And then solutions become hard to implement because you are too general and then can't find the solution because you're trying to do multiple policies at the same time, but they could be hard to balance. So, for example, you want to be really welfarist, but spend loads of money on stopping immigration, which is not necessarily benefiting the population because you're trying to stop people from entering, but not actually giving them the money, right? So then you have to then balance the book somehow, otherwise you will be voted out if you cause an economic crash. So again, the solutions become hard to implement, right? And to be successful, you have to be sort of, when you're being anti-elite, you have to stop technocrats or lobbyists or big businesses from having lots of control. But the more you do that in a pressure cooker environment where you want to stop them having lots of control, you can't very effectively. So what do? You stop them from having loads of power, and that's when you overcorrect and cause authoritarianism, right? Or like semi-authoritarianism, which has been a problem in Latin America, especially with people who came in with very good intentions, but then caused electoral manipulation and stopped the courts from having a say, etc. And that could, that is often how you try to deal with that situation to make sure voters still vote for you, because populists at the end of the day still want to be re-elected, right? Okay, and then finally, let's talk maybe about, again, I want to caveat before I talk about these things. Lots of these examples, they have done really bad things, and this is not an endorsement of these individuals, but examples of when you can defend some parts of populism that could be good. So, for example, LSE had a motion of, this house believes that the tenure of Narendra Modi in India has done more harm than good. Now, obviously, here, you can talk about the good things that he did. And the debate invites that, obviously, right? So, like, there's obviously, even if there are bad things about people and leaders, you can still highlight the good things and then weigh them, right? So that's really important. So a good example is AMLO in Mexico. So he was quite left wing, and the issue for AMLO was that he created more corruption in Mexico in terms of the fact that he caused more problems in terms of stopping the courts from having a say, shutting out the elites too much and then entrenching power, and that he created authoritarian drift, which is basically where he just is not really authoritarianism, but made things worse by removing electoral watchdogs, etc. So it stopped people from actually verifying the election, which is what I just said in the previous slide, right? But he did remove some parts of corruption in Mexico. He implemented like minimum wage laws, more welfarism. He prioritized public investment, so he made elites invest in more like healthcare and hospitals, etc., rather than private insurance. Energy policy was quite good in the development of energy infrastructure. So again, this is good examples which I'll, running out of time, but I would go away and research and make sure that you realize that there could be some good things that they necessarily do. A good example actually is Bernie Sanders is actually quite a good example of a left-wing populist. And this is a great example of grassroots engagement where people felt like they could actually enter Congress, not necessarily physically, but more, it's not just in DC, but and they debate and all that sort of stuff, but he could actually talk to people about what they actually felt. He created a massive awareness of key issues. I'd argue that Medicare and Obamacare, etc., was normalized, and having more access to healthcare that's free because of the way in which he framed things. When it was previously that this private healthcare was really common in America, and people thought it'd be a waste of money or that it wouldn't be fair if people got stuff for free, or that maybe taxing the rich is actually a good thing, and that actually wealth taxation is more accepted in America in opinion polling, right? So again, you can talk about how awareness shifts, and this is a great example of framing that you could use in a country that tends to be quite like individualistic and prioritizes individual liberty. And again, here's a Modi example. I didn't like this guy. just to be clear, but like he has done a lot of great things. So, for example, rural electrification. So, because a lot of his voters came from rural areas, he could do things like prioritizing the farming sector, making sure there's not agricultural destruction from things like climate change, etc. Having rural job schemes to make sure that people don't leave rural areas and leave them behind, but making sure that people can actually work and get a decent wage, and rather than being exploited in like cotton fields, for example. He changed the taxation system to make it easier for people to have businesses across the Indian states, and that he improved in private investments. So India is very, very good for renewable energy right now. Obviously, he's extremely racist, but he has done a lot of good things for India. And the really important thing for why these people are successful is because of strong mandates. A lot of these individuals have, well, maybe not Bernie Sanders, have had massive electoral swings, lots of seats in their parliament. And this means that they can do the things like curbing the elite voice. They can do things like passing things that make elites' lives worse because they have the legitimacy to do so, because they have the mandate. People have said, we want these policies. So, for example, with rural prioritization in India, a lot of Modi's voters were rural, whereas, for example, the previous party, like the Indian National Congress, etc., were very urban. They wouldn't do things like rural electrification. But now Modi had to do rural electrification, otherwise he would lose his rural voters in the next election, right? So there can be very good things to, like, for example, having the generalistic campaigning, right? Because then it makes you actually do things because you feel like you have the votes to do so. And then legitimizes policies, so for redistributive policies, which could require taxing the rich, or anti-corruption measures, which could be what in the Mexico example, right? And then I've spoken about the way that populists engage and then media, etc., to create mass movements there as well. And then also strong central coordination. So, for example, there's often populists will often cut bureaucracy to make it easier for them to pass policy, and that could be a great example of that as well. But that can obviously go too far with the pressure cooking thing I was saying, right? Like you can have electoral manipulation, and that makes it much worse. So it's about the way in which populists often, unfortunately, have to go too far. And then another example, and the final example, is like Morales in Bolivia. I've chosen this example in particular because here is the focus on identity, which is a good thing. So, for example, racial, class injustice, for example, indigenous rights, and giving back land to these groups of individuals, poverty programs, which allow them to get better literacy rates, using natural resource wealth, from the fact they have lots of gas, and they also nationalizes the industry. So this is a great example of when you could redress injustices by being a populist as well. And that's really important. And where it can be quite harmful, I've not included, but South Africa, where, for example, the African economic freedom fighters and also Jacob Zuma's party, that I can't remember the name of, was really successful because he split from the African National Congress. These are good examples of where they want to have arguably quite extreme land redistribution rights. But again, populists can care about groups of individuals that are minorities without demonizing them. Often there are examples where people often do. So, for example, Nigel Farage, Trump, etc., when it comes to the people crossing the border, immigration, etc. But there can be positive immigration stories, I guess, or minority cases as well. Okay. So I just about finished up with that. And just as I predicted, I rambled for quite a long time, so I have filled up most of the time. Hopefully that was useful. Please feel free to ask questions, or if there's something in these slides that you expected to come up which didn't come up, please ask, because it may not be that your question is not valid, but probably because I've forgotten to include it, because yeah. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And if you don't want to be recorded, we can also turn off the recording, and then you can ask that as well. But hopefully this was helpful. I never know if these things are, but yeah. Well, the ones I give anyway, because I'm quite, So thanks.
This is not really a question, but more something to add. And that is, it might be worth also looking in the 30s, 40s, 50s in Latin America, because there was a wave of populism across the region. And that incorporated a lot more the poorer classes and people who were previously excluded from politics. It was exactly a wave of left-wing populism.
Yeah.
So that might be worth for people to look into. For instance, Perón in Argentina, I think, stuff like this.
Yeah, thank you, Rena. I think that's what is that like pink tide ideology, I'm pretty sure, or something like that. I think that that is definitely a great.
I think so, but it might be slightly before that. I'm not entirely sure. I know I had a course on this.
Yeah. This is a great example because it also shows that the swings of how people vote. So obviously in the last we're now getting arguably political commentators are saying we're getting back to second pink tide wave. But before that we had a lot of conservative waves, with the Bolsonaro, etc. And it's really interesting to see how voting behavior changes structurally across regions in the way that people respond to different things. And that could be due to lots of macro factors like economic factors. And again, like bringing up the poorer classes, like everyone was talking about, like depending on what the most important, the way in which people view politics, again, as I was talking about in the first couple of slides, is really important in how people actually engage in the sort of how populism grows across borders, I guess, as well. Thank you for that. That's really helpful, I think.
I have a question. The criticism I get a lot when I'm debating and I run an argument about populism is that I don't prove a tipping point for things to change. Do you have any specific advice on how to maybe use some of the things in the workshop to frame an impact which is more believable, or to avoid this criticism in a round?
Yeah, so the main so the tipping point in motions with populism. Yeah. So I think there's lots of low burden things that you can do. So for example, if you take the internet or social media example, you can talk about how people receive news, which I think is really important, and how people get awareness of things, and shifting the political agenda and shifting the way that people actually talk about policies could be really important. And you can talk about how, again, I think the main thing is talking about how populists are not in isolation, but how they have a direct synergistic reaction with other groups of individuals, so other politicians who might not be populists. So you could talk about how populism may affect how other parties view themselves and how they change their policy positions. I think that maybe a tipping point in populism may not necessarily be about the policy angles of populism, but again, I was talking about is how voters are likely to vote, how their voting behavior changes, how information is disseminated, and how information shifts across political parties and how they like frame things, which I think could be easier ways to reach tipping points. But I think the thing you want to prioritize when thinking about tipping points is what specifically is causing the process. So, for example, what is the method by which people are employing to get people to believe a certain thing? And why is that not being achieved in mainstream politics? And you can use some of the stuff in the slides that I've spoken about in the way that people frame things, which I've spoken about. And I think that would be the main thing. I think populism often doesn't work in tipping points when it comes to sort of like outcomes, purely because I think there's like a multitude of things that could affect the way in which they like end up passing that policy. But yeah, I think that would be the main thing. Did you want to maybe like talk about an example of where that wasn't credited, if you feel comfortable to do so? I don't know if that helped answer your question.
No, it helps for sure. I don't have an example right now on the top of my head, but yeah, definitely helps. Thank you.
Yeah. And again, as I was saying, the non-political aspects of populism, so for example, community forming, how they get information, catharsis and awareness is really important. So that the Bernie Sanders example of wealth taxation becoming more palatable, or healthcare rights, for example, is a great example of of an easy tipping point to prove, because it's about the way in which you frame as a populist the why it's important, which you wouldn't do as a Democrat or a Republican, because they tend to be more focused on how to pay for it, how to fund it, how it would get passed through Congress. So you could talk about the difference being like one's ideational or cares more about why something's important, and the other one tends to be, I want voters to vote for me because I want them to see that I can actually implement the thing, because I can get legitimacy from the fact that I know how to implement the policy, right? So then you could talk about how they frame things differently, and then why one shifts the goalposts more than the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
There was also, I believe it was the first debate I've ever had where someone used populism not necessarily as a strategy, but more so as a mechanism of when something is popular by the the group, well, the population at large, that there will be someone to pick up on this idea to run with it, either pragmatically or actually doing so. Would you also say that that could fall under this?
So what you mean is that, so are you trying to say that the mechanism was trying to say that sorry, what was the specific example? Was there, or was it just a general mechanism?
There probably was a specific example, but it was quite a while ago.
Okay.
But in this regard, I might look at examples like, say, after the Second World War, some countries implementing more labor policies because they were more popular among groups at large.
Right. As in like how popularity maybe used, popularity and populism might be similar or not similar in improving something. Is that what you mean?
Kind of the opposite of how this would work, but also the same in some regard. So because something is popular, someone will eventually try and run with it and potentially implement it.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I think the main thing is that often populism can implement popular policies, but it's the way in which they are framed and how the solution is likely to be implemented. So, for example, there obviously are examples where the fact that people are not getting something, or the fact that there is inequality, there could be a solution which is quite obvious but is not being implemented because people don't realize different people's lived experiences. So it becomes often policy. And then, but it could also be about the way in which they frame popular policy, for example, these labor policies, etc., and why they're important, which would, I think, delineate why maybe a populist might view a popular policy different to a mainstream party. I hope that answers what you're trying to get at, but I'm not sure if I am.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great.
Okay, it seems like we've got no more questions. Thanks, Parth, for giving the workshop. Parth is also going to stay here to help actually with the spar. They'll stop recording for now, and then we can put this on the Dutch Quest platform channel as quickly as possible.